The Air India 787 mishap preliminary investigation report is out, and it creates more questions than answers, I think. We're going to talk about the preliminary findings and discuss kind of what that means and what it might mean and how that will relate to the rest of the investigation. I've been on the 787 for about a year now, so I'll do my best to explain how the systems work as we go. All right, so this is a report. We'll kind of do it backwards. We'll start out with the narrative, and then we'll go through the specific details after. So the narrative for the accident flight on 12 June 2025, Air India 787-8 bearing VT A and B arrived at Ahmedabad Airport operating AI 423 from Delhi, touchdown at 0547 UTC, which was 1117 IST, parked at Bay 34. The crew of the previous flight had made a pilot defect report entry for status message stab pause XDCR in the tech log. Troubleshooting was carried out per FIM by Air India's maintenance, and the aircraft was released for flight at 0640 UTC. Aircraft was scheduled to operate Air India 171 to Gatwick with a departure time of 13:10. Flight was to be operated by the crew comprising of an ATPL holder PIC, who's the captain, CPL holder co-pilot, and 10 cabin crew. So 2-man crew. Both pilots were based at Mumbai and had arrived the previous day. They had adequate rest. The co-pilot, so first officer, was the pilot flying, and the PIC was pilot monitoring, and that's why this is important, because who's doing what, and we'll talk about it in detail. The crew arrived at the airport, underwent pre-flight breath analyzer test at 0625, and were found fit to operate the flight. The crew is seen arriving at the boarding gate and CCTV recording at about 0705 at 12:35 local. There were 230 passengers on board, out of which 15 passengers were in business class, 215 passengers were in economy class, including 2 infants. So it does not say anything about jump seaters or non-revenue passengers, anybody that would operate either the cabin jump seats or the cockpit jump seats. Fuel on board was 54,200 kilograms per the load and trim sheet of the flight, and the takeoff weight was within allowable limits. There was no dangerous goods. Calculated V speeds were V1 of 153, VR 155, V2 162. So the replay of the flight was carried out of the accident. They departed from Bay 34 at 0748. Taxi clearance was received. They taxied to runway 23 via taxiway Romeo 4, backtracked and lined up. So full length. They didn't take off short or anything like that. I know that's something I bit off on very early on. It's just the ADS-B data was wrong. Takeoff clearance was issued. They started rolling at 080737. Per the EAFR data, the aircraft crossed the takeoff decision speed V1, achieved 153 knots at 0833. They hit VR of 155 knots at 0835. And then they transitioned to air mode at 0839. So liftoff at about 4 seconds after VR. So everything is seemingly on schedule. Aircraft achieved a maximum recorded airspeed of 180 knots indicated at about 0842, so 3 seconds later. And immediately thereafter, the Engine 1 and Engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff, one after another with a time gap of 1 second. So it was 1, 2, not together. It was 1 and then 2. They don't say in which order that it happened, but if this is to believe, it could be Engine 1, Engine 2. I'll talk about why that's important here in a little bit. The Engine 1, N1, and N2 began to decrease from their takeoff values as the fuel supply of the engine was cut off. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other pilot, why did he cut off? And the other pilot responded that he did not do so. CCTV footage obtained showed the ram air turbine getting deployed during the initial climb immediately after liftoff. With no significant bird activity was observed in the flight path, it started to lose altitude before crossing the perimeter wall. As per the EAFR data, N2 values passed below minimum idle speed, and the RAT hydraulic pump began supplying hydraulic power at 0847, which is 5 seconds after they were at cutoff. The Engine 1 fuel cutoff switch then transitioned from cutoff to run at about 0852. APU inlet door began opening at 0854, consistent with APU auto start logic, because 3 generators fall offline, APU starts to auto start. Thereafter, 0856, the engine 2 fuel cutoff switch also transitions from cutoff to run. So 54 is the APU, 52. So you go 52, engine 1 cutoff, 54. So everything is within 2 seconds. 56, the engine 2 fuel cutoff switch, it goes from cutoff to run. When fuel control switches are moved from cutoff to run and the aircraft is in flight, the FADEC or EECs automatically manage a relight thrust recovery sequence of ignition and fuel introduction. We call them EECs. In all our manuals, everything's an EEC. Electronic engine controls. EGT was observed to be rising for both engines, indicating relight. Engine 1's core deceleration stopped, so it was rolling back, and then it got a relight. Those engines take a long time to restart, and they take a long time to start on the ground. So big engines, big core, takes a while. Engine 2 was able to relight, but could not arrest core speed deceleration and reintroduce fuel repeatedly to increase core. This is all happening automatically. The jet is smart. It knows what it's doing. It's trying to do a relight, and it'll keep doing it as many times as it takes. At 0905, one of the pilots transmitted Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. The ATCO inquired about the call sign. ATCO did not give any response, but observed the aircraft crashing outside the airport boundary. So all they said was Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. I think there was some other stuff about losing power or something, but this just says Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And then it crashed, crash and fire, left the airport to go firefight. So that's what the initial narrative is. Let's break it down in detail. So the aircraft type, 787-8. So there's variants, -8, -9, -10. It's the length and the max gross takeoff weight of the aircraft, and engines are a little different on the -9s and 10s. Last major maintenance check was carried out at 38,005. That's a high time, still a high time aircraft. Next major was December 2025. There were 4 Cat C MEL items on the aircraft as of the date in question. These MELs, so minimum equipment list stuff, is stuff you can fly with, but it's like you know about it in the book. There's sometimes different conditions that you can fly with MEL items. Flight deck door visual surveillance, airport map function, which is on your MFD, and core network. That's an interesting one. And then the flight deck printer. So, I'd hate that, man. You want the printer because you could print out all your ATIS and clearances and stuff like that from the ACARs. Cat A MEL, nitrogen generation performance, which is valid till 6/20. There were some Cat D MELs related to cabin and cargo. They were within the due date. All applicable airworthiness directives and alert service buildings were complied with on the aircraft as well as the engine. The FAA issued special airworthiness information bulletin November Mike 1833 in December of 2018 regarding potential disengagement of the fuel control switch locking feature. It was based on reports from operators of the 737, which has the same little nubs, that the fuel control switches were installed with locking feature disengaged. So that locking feature wasn't working properly. Because what happens, you've got the fuel control switches. There's 2 of them on that pedestal. They're right behind the throttles. And to get them to go on, you have to go out and up, and they lock. And to get them to go down, you have to go out and down. Like, you can't just push them down. You have to go out and down. If that locking mechanism, the out and down, is malfunctioning, conceivably, you could just go straight down and turn it off, but you'd still have to do a motion to turn it off. The airworthiness concern was not considered an unsafe condition that would warrant airworthiness directive by the FAA. Fuel control switch design, including the locking feature, is similar on various Boeing airplane models, including part number, blah, 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 which is fitted in the 787. As per the information from Air India, the suggested inspections were not carried out as the SIAB was advisory and not mandatory. Scrutiny of maintenance records revealed the throttle control module was replaced in 2019-2023. However, the reason for the replacement was not linked to fuel control switch. There was no defect reported pertaining to fuel control switch. That's something somebody would have written up. And I know there's been a theory, and I initially thought this too, of when you take off, let's go through the whole takeoff sequence. I've talked about this on the Mover and Donkey show. Pilot flying is the FO. Pilot monitoring is the captain. So right seat is the actual guy flying. Pilot monitoring is left seat. When you do that way, at least at my airline, the captain lines up because he's doing all the steering on the ground. He lines up, says your aircraft. So when it's my aircraft and the FO side, runs it up to 40%, spools up the engine, gets them stabilized, and then hits the toga. Walks with the throttles automatically go to the takeoff setting for the N1 that is appropriate for whatever takeoff you have, whatever takeoff power, takeoff thrust. And then as soon as the thrust is set, so the captain says thrust set, or the pilot monitoring says thrust set. As soon as that's set, the FO takes his hand off the throttle because the captain, at least my airline, and I think this is how most U.S. airlines do it. I don't know about Air India, but I'm assuming it's pretty universal because it's Boeing training. The captain then puts his hand on the throttle because he's the one that's going to do the rejected takeoff. At my airline, FOs cannot call for or do a rejected takeoff. So captain's got his hand on the throttle. He's got his right hand on the throttle. The FO is working the rudder pedals and the yoke. So that happens all the way until V1. At V1, the captain then takes his hand off the throttle. Now, where's the FO's hand during this? Well, it's an emphasis item at my airline that you guard the throttles. And I think this is where that theory comes from. Guarding the throttles means put your hand behind the throttle because you don't want it to unintentionally be ripped to idle or come off the takeoff power. But a lot of people, because they don't want to get their hands pinched, if the captain were to reject, they rest their hands or keep their hands right next to those fuel control switches, the cutoff switches. So your hand is there, conceivably, right? That could, if the switches aren't working, right? If your hand slaps, you could accidentally, if both of them were broken, which is a 1 in a million thing, both of them were broken. If your hand goes down, you could shut both engines off per this AD. The reason I don't think that's the case is because of later in the narrative, there's a 1 second delay between the left and right engine going to cutoff. That's one. Two, that this is up to V1. At V1, the FO takes his left hand, if he's been doing that, puts it on both, usually, most people do, both hands of the yoke or one hand on the, or their hand on the throttle. Because after V1, the captain takes his hand off the throttle, nobody's on the throttle. But the FO, usually both hands on the yoke to do the rotation and the climb out. I would think the FO would have both hands on the yoke for that part. I don't think the FO would still be guarding. Now, the captain could have put his hand down there. But again, I don't think that's an inadvertent decision because 1 second tells me it's deliberate. Someone deliberately, that's the same pacing you used at the gate when you shut the engines down. You go 1 and then 2. That's my opinion. I think that's something they're going to look at. I don't know. And I don't know that we're ever going to know because, I mean, unless they had video in the cockpit, it's going to be very hard to tell who did what and why. And this may be something we never know. But my opinion as an S787 pilot is FO is pulling back with both hands on the yoke or a hand on the yoke and a hand on the throttle. And now the captain is the one guarding. So he's the one with a free hand. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense because what's next after rotation? The captain is now looking outside, either through the HUD or down at his primary flight display, because he's waiting for positive rate, because he's going to say his next call out after rotate is positive rate, and the FO is going to say gear up. So this is a very busy time. So it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but let's continue. There's the damage. Very unfortunate with the impact. And again, we feel for the families of those that lost loved ones. I mean, there's a lot of victims here, and I don't want to pilot blame because we don't know what happened yet. I think the investigation's got a lot of work cut out for them. There's the wreckage. Very sad. Aircraft was losing altitude initially, made contact with a series of trees, and that's the angle that it hit. And that's probably why that one guy survived, is just because of the angle that it hit. I mean, that's just incredible. So this is the slide here. Here's the fuel cutoff switches. And what you can see is those are the two fuel cutoff switches, and they were both in the up position. They were both in run. So it says the flap handle assembly sustained significant thermal damage. The handle was found to be firmly seated in the 5-degree flap position, which is consistent with normal takeoff. Position was also confirmed with EAFR data. Landing gear lever handle was in the down position because they didn't even get to that part, right? Positive rate gear up. They had gotten to V1 rotate and never got to positive rate gear up because everything started going wrong at this point. Thrust levers quadrant sustained significant thermal damage, were found near the idle position. However, the EFR data revealed the thrust levers remained forward until impact. Both fuel control switches were found in the run position. The reverser levers were bent with this, but were in the stowed position. Wiring from toga switches, auto throttle disconnect switches were visible but heavily damaged. So experience, this was another thing a lot of people got wrong. The FO was not just a low time 1,100 hour. He was 1,100 hours on type. He was an experienced dude, 3,400 hours total time. And the captain wasn't just 8,500 hours. He was 8,500 hours in type. He had 15,000 hours. So, and they had been flying regularly. They weren't non-current, etc. So, he had gotten a CPL 5 years ago, and the captain had been probably on the airplane for 4 years there. So, I mean, because you get a reissue every time you get a type rating. So, I mean, the captain was experienced. 310, 777, A310. I mean, and the FO had been flying a 320 before this. Airbus transfer. Airbus is different than Boeing products, but the weather was hot, but not significant. The questions I have as we look at this is in what order would the engines cut off, right? Because to me, something like this, it's based off of what is closer to you. Because when I do stuff, if you don't, the checklist doesn't call for an order, it's typical to do it what's closest to you, right? If it's 1 then 2, to me that's probably the captain. So where it says the engine 1 and 2 fuel cutoff switches transition from run to cutoff, if someone did it in the cockpit, like I first thought jump seater, but there's no jump seater unless there was a jump seater that no one accounted for, in which case I would think they would put this in there because they would know from the CVR. But if it's 1 then 2, to me that indicates the captain because it's closest. 1 is on the left side, captain's on the left side. That's who would do it. Turning them back on 1 then 2, to me is a captain thing because it's closest to him and he's just trying to flip switches on. So could it have been the FO? Yeah, could have been the FO. I mean, he could have been flying with one hand. My question would be, why didn't he just push over? If he was suicidal, because that's a suicidal act and a criminal act, why not just push over and crash unless he was worried that the captain would fight him? So, shut down the engines right after rotations, the most dangerous part of a flight. And every pilot knows that. So you reach over and shut him down. They did say, he goes, why did you do that? And he didn't. And he said, I didn't. Now, is someone who's doing that going to tell the truth? Probably not. Or is the person who did it, for CVR purposes, going to look over and say, why'd you do that? Even though, it's gaslighting. He's the one that did it. Unless they can voice ID and know who did what switch, it's going to be tough to figure that out. So I don't think at this point in the investigation that it was a mechanical or aircraft issue, unless there's some new problem that no one's ever thought of. The airworthiness directive or the bulletin that we talked about at the beginning, if that happened, I think both engines, there wouldn't be a 1 second delay. 1 second delay because you have to physically go up and down tells me someone deliberately did it. And so now the question is, why did they deliberately do it? Were they suicidal? Were they tired and just thought, something happened? Was it intrusive thoughts? I don't know. I mean, this wouldn't be the first time, right? We've seen German wings, Egypt Air, maybe even MH370, which we still don't know what happened with that. There was obviously some speculation with the captain there, but we just don't know. So this is going to be one of those ones where it's like, what could possibly happen to make somebody deliberately cut off at the worst possible time, cut off the engines? Because that's what the fuel cutoff does. The fuel cutoff is what you do to start the engines because it introduces the fuel, and what you do to turn off the engines, like when you get to the gate, or in the event of dual engine failure, it is part of the checklist, which you don't do till 400 feet, at least in my airline. Especially we use QRCs, we don't even use memory items anymore. But you don't do it until 400 feet, and you turn them off, then turn them right back on because you're trying to reset the EECs. That's not what happened here because they're asking each other, why'd you do that? Right? There was no indication of a problem up to this point. So there's no indication that they were just following a checklist or doing something that they needed to do. So that doesn't make sense. Everything seems to point to a deliberate act by one of the pilots flying, whether it's the co-pilot or the FO and the captain. I mean, conceivably, could the captain have done it because it went 1-2 and then said, why'd you do that? I didn't realize what he did and then tried to restart him? Possibly. Could the FO have been the one doing it while he was flying? Possibly. Neither of those things makes any sense to me, but we can't think when you I'm in law enforcement too, right? When you start to think of people doing crimes, sometimes the rational is not where it's going to be, because people that are willing to commit murder, suicide in this case are not going to be rational. It's not going to make a lot of sense of why they would do that. There could be issues with the geopolitical stuff with Pakistan and India. We don't know. But from my experience with this aircraft, you are in a position at rotation that the FO should be probably one hand on the yoke, one hand on the throttle, or both hands on the yoke, looking out the HUD, worried about climbing out. And the captain is focused on positive rate in Europe. That is the part of the flight that they were in. So what caused one of them to reach over and go fuel cutoff at the pedestal? We don't know. As far as the other systems, everything worked as advertised. The RAT, when the motor spooled down below idle, will automatically deploy. It did. The APU, when the 3 generators are offline, will automatically start. It did. The EECs will automatically relight or attempt to relight when the fuel cutoff switches go back to run. It tried. And honestly, I think the most heartbreaking thing is they may have been, plus or minus 5 to 10 seconds from this being survivable and being a criminal act that, there might be a fight in the cockpit versus this mass tragedy. We don't know. I wouldn't rule out some kind of mechanical failure. I wouldn't throw the pilots under the bus immediately, but everything seems to point to a deliberate act at right now. And as more data comes available, obviously we'll look. This is just a preliminary investigation, but I don't know that we're ever going to get the answer, because if you can't identify who did what switch and why, this may go down as another, unsolved mystery. And that is terrible, but it's not the aircraft. The 787 is a safe aircraft, and this is not because of something that the 787 did. Even if the switches were broken, someone had to physically manipulate them. They don't just happen. Those are physical switches that cannot be. And the idea, because somebody said, well, they're physical switches, but they're connected to EECs. That's true. They're connected to electronics. However, the one pilot saying, why did you do that? The only way he knows is if he physically looks and verifies the position of the switch. Otherwise, it would look like a dual engine flame out, and then they would be calling for the checklist. The fact that somebody said, why did you do that, means that those switches physically moved, which means it's not a software problem. This is a hardware issue. I think it's deliberate, but because of the 1 second gap, but I guess we'll find out as we get the final report. But anyway, let me know in the comments what you think. This is awful. This is a terrible tragedy, and I feel for the victims of this. It's terrible. But thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.